So we have VC and PM. Why don't you give us your elevator pitch of what exactly the scale zone is?
I'm an employee, so I'm someone who's not taking care of the money you will receive at the end of the month, and working in a company trying to transform and be adapted in the society we're living on. So scale zone, do I do the pitch now?
Just an elevator pitch. We don't want long. We'll kick you off otherwise.
It's like, how do you industrialize? How do you go with a B2B startup, working with large organization, and deploy finally an innovative project at scale?
So you're not an incubator?
Not an incubator.
Okay, we got it. That's good. We're also using Slido, so if you've got questions for the panel, do feel free to put them in, and hopefully we'll get time to check some of them out. Okay, given that it is GDPR Day here in Europe, we're all very excited. There have even been a few complaints already lodged against Facebook and Google. So I wanted to get the panel's thoughts on whether this new data protection framework is going to hinder or help EU startups. Who wants that one? Simon, perhaps.
What a question to open with. Okay, look, the change is good for venture capitalists and entrepreneurs because when things change, new opportunities arise. So I think we had a discussion about this the other day, but I think we're coming to a world where the internet we built for the last 20 years is broken and we need a new one. And I think that new one needs to be built in partnership with regulators and protection for civilians and users. So I think it's the starting point of a shift in the way we build technology, which is much more inclusive of everything we have to think about. So I think it's a good sign, but it's probably just the start of a very long journey. And it will mean lots of different companies will miss their numbers this quarter, and some will make their numbers, and some startups will jump into those opportunities, I think.
But it's a startup opportunity, right? It's a change, it's disruption, so there's opportunity there, right? Any thoughts?
Well, yeah, as entrepreneurs, what we are always asking to Europe is to harmonize the rules at European level so that you don't have one rule per country. And I think even though it started with a more constraint than an enabler, at least it's a very good example of having a single rule throughout Europe. And I thought it was pretty nice to have Mark Zuckerberg have to explain to his own senator how he would how he would comply to Europe rule rather than the opposite, having always European company have to play with the US rules. So I think it's one measure and one domain where we have one set of rules throughout Europe, which can be really positive in the long run.
All right, I won't press you anymore on regulation. Well, maybe later. Let's go back to DRIVY. You're founded in Europe. You've been here for a long time now. You're in, I think, about 6 European markets. Can you tell us why how that kind of came about? Did you really decide that you wanted to be a European business? Did you kind of close off the idea of going global, or how did that sort of evolve, that decision?
To be very transparent, I didn't really decide that. I mean, Paris was where I was living. It's a very, very powerful city for new mobility. So actually, there was not much question of trying to find a better city, because in terms of innovation in all new mobility, Paris has always been super active. It's one of the cities in the world with the highest percentage of people who don't own a car, so who are open to any kind of other solutions. So then it just happened, and honestly, from day one, I didn't think of a whole plan of how I would go first to that city, that country, then this other continent. It just happened, and then the appetite came with the success later on.
So could you imagine going to internationally now at this stage of the business? Sort of, I think how many years? You founded in 2010, or?
Yeah, the idea was really 2010,
yeah.
And so now today we are in 6 European countries, in the UK, Germany, Spain, Belgium, Austria, and France. And what's interesting, we were really looking at countries when we started, so we were thinking, let's open a country, and now increasingly we want a density of our self-service cars inside the cities. We are targeting walking distance proximity, so we are more moving to a city model compared to a country model. So the whole dynamics of expansion now is more city-based, and I think Europe is fantastic for a city strategy because of the density of the city network, the size, the cultural proximity, for example, could be much better than the US, for example, with the size and the differences between cities.
So what other kind of European cities are you looking at and thinking that looks like a good opportunity?
Well, the last one we opened was London a few months ago, and it's been really quite successful in terms of engagement of the users and start of the marketplace. So we already have hundreds of cars available there. So I think Paris was great, and London is probably the second highest potential city for us.
Simon, do you, city by city, is that a piece of advice that you often give startups that you're mentoring?
Yeah, it's fascinating because the whole idea of countries are a human invention of only about 300 years, right? And we probably are going back to a world of city-states. So, you know, if you do a list of cities in the world, it looks very different than if you do it by countries. And, you know, and as New York got anything to, New York's probably got more to do with London and Paris than they might have to do with Milwaukee or Arkansas, right? Or some. So, yeah, cities are where, you know, most of the population is heading. So it is a really interesting way to think about, you know, doing a startup, particularly in the kind of transportation world.
And I mean, it could be a sort of a home advantage for Europe because we do have a lot of quite dense, sort of urbanized cities, really, relatively speaking, as a region.
No, absolutely. Again, if you drew a list of, it's a really interesting exercise, but go on Wikipedia and see the cities by population. You know, you have Seoul. I think London's number 4. You have Seoul, New York, Tokyo, Beijing. But you know, we have a number in the top 10, 20, which is really interesting when you start to think, you know, and literally countries are a figment of our imagination in some respect, right? That we invented them a few hundred years ago as a political construct. They may not exist in 200 years' time.
I mean, London might Brexit from the UK, right? So.
Well, and Tim's trying to split California into 3, right? So.
Well, indeed. One of the things that we obviously know and hear a lot is that VC funding is relatively less available in Europe versus Silicon Valley, obviously. But I wonder how much of a problem is that really? I read an interesting thread on Twitter by the Atomico VC, Tom Weimer, and he was sort of saying he was aiming to debunk some classic European tech myths. And in his analysis of the data, he was saying there were at least $78 billion plus tech companies that have been founded in Europe since 1990, but only 60% were VC backed. So other sources of investment and support are clearly available. Where else kind of should startups be looking for support and scale if the VC that they would love to get just isn't available for them?
Well, I couldn't agree more. I mean, one of the things we've done is change the venture model. So we went public the week before Brexit, so 2 years ago this week. Because we found that there's huge interest to invest in technology and startups, but it's in different kinds of fund structures. So as soon as you start to open your mind and think differently about any industry, you can unlock huge amounts. So, and we raised 200 million euros this morning. It took us 4 days because we've turned the whole model on its
Congratulations.
head. And the people who've invested us want to put more and more money to work. So when we stopped copying the American limited partnership model, we found it unlocked a huge opportunity. And I think one of the reasons the fintech revolution is happening more in Europe is because the SEC is a really, you know, anti-innovation culture and regulatory body. And in Europe, we have a lot more free-thinking, open-minded regulators. And you know, the government support at an event like this is phenomenal. And you know, people don't realize how anti-innovation the American, you know, system can be.
That's not a message we often hear, is it?
They're very good at marketing.
This is very true. Pierre, any thoughts on that?
Yes, from what we see inside IBM and in France in Scalezone, we are not more touched than we are not more into investments than into revenue. We are trying to help startups creating revenue more than looking for investment. So they handle all these questions before arriving inside the Scalezone. So now I think the good question is like, how do you reach your market and how do you earn money by selling actually something? So I always say, like, it's not because you raised a lot of money that your company is profitable, that your product will be sold and so on. So, yeah, I don't know what to say more, but like, there is not just only a VC problem in scaling a company. It's not also it's also, and I think this is the main reason. Like, your offer need to find this market, and your product need to correspond to people, so that it's used.
Paulin, any thoughts?
Well, I think like 5-10 years ago, you heard about a few examples of companies with great metrics in Europe, but that didn't really find like growth capital or seed capital actually. I think I would say it tends to disappear, and I would say the problem in the funding now is not in the availability of funds to travel to Paris, Berlin, or to set up shops there. There are tons of fantastic funds in Europe. It's more like the real question to me is more on the revenue side and on the scale side, and that's when typically US and Chinese companies tend to grow faster. I think that unfortunately the real question is really on the hard part, on can European companies scale really as fast as US or Chinese companies?
Can they? Do you believe they can? Do you want to answer your own question?
Yeah, definitely, and I think it's really the network effects and the economies of scale, depending if it's a worldwide marketing, like a SaaS B2B software, for example, that can market worldwide, whether it's a country marketing or city marketing, it makes the dynamics very different. In any of those three models, you can obviously be a unicorn and be in Europe, but if it's a country economies of scale, then you have more hurdles to jump to be in 10 countries in Europe compared to just one market for other competitors. And you have to be really good at jumping these hurdles fast and planning ahead with a very international team and product from day one.
And if you're going for this city by city idea, that I mean, presumably you don't need a kind of an office in every city. You can scale agilely by managing with one office per country. How do you do it in your markets?
So in our case, we are 120 people. We have around 80 people in Paris, and then country offices, so not city offices, with around 10 people doing business development, marketing, and communications. So definitely, we can move the attention of the marketing and biz dev teams from a city to another. We decide on a set of key cities, and then we can move. So we don't need to set up like a heavy structure that would cost a lot of cash. So you can be pretty nimble in Europe. It's super easy to travel between the cities. The culture, like going from obviously Brussels to Paris to London,
we have great public transport, right?
Exactly.
And that's a huge European advantage. Simon, did you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I just disagree a little bit. I mean, I think you absolutely do need to have the skills and knowledge and the experience to be able to scale up. But frankly, it always does come down to capital. I think you used to have to go to the Valley. Half the startups in the Valley are started by Chinese, Indians, entrepreneurs because the money and the ecosystem was there. But it was the money that was there. It's been there for a long time. I think we are moving to a place where that skill set is now more global. Silicon Valley is a state of mind and a set of execution skills, and it still does come down to capital. And it's fascinating to watch the Chinese have now started to beat the Americans at their own game. If you take the ride-on bike model, the OFOs and O-bikes, those startups did their A and B and C rounds and raised $200, $300 million before anybody in Silicon Valley had even spotted that they were coming. And so that was for me the very first time that an entrepreneur could raise more capital and go faster from one different part of the world into California. And if there's anything I want to get across, I think we can do that here now. I think so many companies don't have the ambition. They think America. Let's just do Europe and let's not do Asia and let's not do America. But you can. We were. Tim was in Skype and Draper helped Skype. We're in companies like Tesla, SpaceX. If there's anything we want to try and bring over here, it's that ambition. And it's fantastic to see the Chinese are matching that capital with ambition. I do believe we're getting to the point in Europe that we can start to really unlock, tens and hundreds of millions to move really quickly. So for me, it always does come down to capital because you can only go as fast as what you've got in the bank.
Why do you think there's this sort of lack of ambition, for want of a better phrase? And we see the Chinese companies coming over now with the bike sharing startups. We've got some US peer-to-peer car, not exactly the same as you, but coming over here as well. Why aren't you, for instance, going over there first? Why is that this is sort of a European phenomenon that we're very happy here because we have great food, great culture. Maybe that's why. Why is it that we're not pushing in the way that Chinese startups now are pushing, and the way that obviously American startups have been doing for a very long time?
Well, I'm not saying every company should try and be Uber or O-Bike. Right? It's perfectly fine to have whatever ambition level you want. I'm just saying, you know, it is legitimate to think that little bit bigger today, but it's perfectly fine, you know. But I think there was just a feeling that we could never really think about that, and we would always, you know, we built Love Film, which was, you know, the Europe's Netflix, but it was, we could never be Netflix. One of the founders of Love Film was always pushing us to take that company into America, and it's an interesting thought experiment. If we'd actually gone head-to-head with Netflix in America with the Love Film platform, who knows what would have happened. The market may have been big enough, Amazon is there, so I think I'm challenging the thinking that not everybody has to do it, but we can legitimately start to do it today as more and more success. You know, the multi-billion-dollar IPOs are happening a lot in Europe right now. There's lots of capital flowing. People are getting much more confident in our skill set.
Any thoughts, Paulin?
Well, in our case, I mean, it was really like opening our first country in Germany was really tough, and then the next countries were pretty easy. So worldwide in our field, we are now the most international company of the game with the 6 countries. So definitely, we need some intensity in every city. So we don't just want to open new countries and only have a low density of the fleet. But I think we are extremely well positioned to go to any new city in new countries in the coming years. So I hope we will prove that very soon.
So we might see you in the US then. Is that?
Yeah, definitely. Like if we think like US East Coast cities, which are the most European, for example, so it changes completely the aspect. And typically, New York is not much farther from Europe than from SF or Los Angeles.
Another kind of good story that Europe has is talent, of course. A lot of the US companies are coming over here because there's so much talent and setting up big research kind of hubs. And we've got Facebook, we've got Google, we've got Uber, Amazon. Is that good or bad for local startups? I mean, in a way, it injects energy into the ecosystem, but now you have to compete with those guys. So how do you win the talent from, you know, these new competitors?
Well, our big advantage compared to large companies is not paying higher salaries, but it's more the direct link to the impact of the company that people can see. I think it really matters to the DRIVY team to be able to impact cities directly and to be to be at the headquarters. I think matters quite a lot for typically product and tech people. So really the premium in terms of direct impact you can have and scale of what you do is awesome. But then I think just the bigger the ecosystem, the bigger for everybody, even though there is a competition, because more people will get trained to the best practices. And I think the more research centers we can have in Europe, the better, even for startups that sometimes on a case-by-case basis would compete for the same engineer, but in the end, just the larger the talent pool, the better.
You know, I saw some interesting data the other day that said the big tech companies lose as many people a year as they're hiring by acquisition. So they're just treading water. So, you know, they don't talk about it, but people keep leaving and doing startups, and they have to keep buying them back. And it's a hell of a lot more lucrative way to build your career, to go out, have some fun, do a startup, and then they might have to buy you back in for tens of millions of dollars, right? It is a circle. It is not us versus them.
Yeah, I think the average stay for in the largest tech companies of Silicon Valley is like 1.5 years for. So you think they are the best companies, the most attractive, but people stay on average 1.5 years. So it's a fantastic machine.
We shouldn't say that too loud in here, right?
Not to PM.
I think we are speaking a lot about commodities, like you are needing some money, you are going to find some great money. You are looking for talented people, you hire. You need to open a new country, you go in this country. But I think we can't lose any trace of thinking about values. It's like, what are the values you are sharing inside your company? Why are your people leaving the company? What are the values you are defending inside the company? And plus, how do you go in another country, understand the culture, and elaborate your offer in front of this culture? So scaling up at the end in Europe is like finding some different cultures, because there are some different countries. It's one Europe, but some different countries. How do you adapt your product to that, with the culture, the humanity behind that, and not only the commodities you are needing in order to scale?
We are almost out of time, but I just want to go down the panel and get a quick piece of practical advice or general advice, as you like, for startups in Europe that are thinking about this scale-up growth problem. Who wants to start?
I think the only one way to scale your company, even if you are a startup working in B2C or B2B, it's confidence and conviction. When you're convinced about something, you do it every way.
Fine words. Pauline?
So try in the initial headquarters team to get as many international people as possible and as many languages as possible. Design the product from day one to be international. And once you have several offices, try to gather people as much as you can, as like physically as much as you can.
Wonderful. And Simon?
I guess my message is just to think big. There's no industry in the world that can't be changed by a startup. The most energizing picture I saw last year was the picture of the Tesla floating in space, right? Those are two startups we did the Series A in, right? So you can, who would have thought that you can take on NASA with a 10-person startup? But, think big and you can do anything, and that's not an American strategy. That's a global strategy, and especially in Europe. And there are so many good engineers. We have such efficient thinking. There's so many of us squeezed onto a tiny bit of land that we're amazing at creating efficient business processes, technologies. The Americans, they just have big cars and big horsepower, and they build big stuff still, right? And the world is we don't need more big stuff. We need more European design and technology.
All right, wonderful. We're over time. Great note to end on. Thank you so much, guys. Pleasure to speak, and thank you.